lots of interesting conversations have happened here since 9 o'clock in the morning, and I promise you they're not over. They continue till 10 o'clock at night. Before I have the privilege of introducing this session to the finest jurists, they require no introduction. Vivek Tankha ji, Mahesh Jethmalani ji, both are members of parliament in the Rajya Sabha, and they've been practicing law for longer than I've lived. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation. Lots of hot topics, gentlemen. I'm going to start it with the very loaded but philosophical question. And let's start with Mahesh ji. Mahesh ji, who has the last word? Now, you're a jurist who's also parliamentarian. So who has the last word? Parliament has the last word, or does the judiciary have the last word?
I'm going to stick with my bread and butter, and I'm going to say the jurist has the last word. And he should have the last word.
What about you, Tankha ji? Who has the last word, sir?
In terms of legislation, Parliament is the last word. In terms of interpretation, it's the court which is the last word.
Okay, so I've got the diplomatic legal answer. So let me twist it around. Tankha ji, there are so many important questions in this country that we often, or rather Parliament or the political system, the legislative system, leaves it to the courts to handle. It can be something as mundane as CNG buses or the environment or pollution in Delhi, or something very serious like, Ayodhya and other issues. Is there an abdication because the politicians feel that hot potatoes leave it to the judiciary, but when it comes to the stuff they want to legislate on, they want to take credit?
I'm sure about one thing, that too many times, too many spaces have been left by the parliamentarians to the judges. In fact, judges have a very limited role. Sitting as judges, they have to interpret the law and enforce the provisions of the Constitution as well as the laws made from the Constitution. What happens today is, for instance, Vishaka. Now, everybody knew that there's a huge issue about women being harassed in workplaces. But there was no legislation. So you're permitting courts to step in because of your own inaction. Forest. Godavarman wouldn't have begun if unabated destruction of forests was not happening in India. It was Justice J.S. Verma in the 90s who stepped in and said, please stop this. Now, henceforth, you will not cut any forest without Supreme Court permission. So why I'm saying this is, why should the legislature or the executive leave this space to the judiciary? Because at the end of the day, there is no such thing as a vacuum. If there's a vacuum, somebody will step in, whether it be the judiciary or the executive or the legislature.
Okay, and that's generally a good thing. So, Mahesh ji, we owe a lot to the judiciary, who takes on these very complicated questions, and we owe a lot to the credibility and the gravitas that it brings in, that even though these are often challenged to the highest levels and repeatedly challenged, even before the courts, once the ruling comes, they are by and large abided by. I think the very rare instances in this country, I mean, down to recently, the release of the assassins of Rajiv Gandhi, where the judiciary has taken a moral and legal position, and even though it is being challenged, it is being abided by. They were released within 24 hours. Is there a vacuum sometimes? Because a lot of the hot potato issues just get left to the judiciary and not necessarily to the domain of parliament. Why is that?
Well, I mean, the government and the legislature are far from perfect. There are always going to be situations you can't conceive of. There is, you can't actually legislate on every aspect. Some things crop up ad hoc. For instance, the entire COVID issue in which the Supreme Court played a very laudable role. So the Supreme Court interfered. It made sure that, when the government was failing, they stepped in, they made the right provisions, passed the right orders. And by and large, the fact that you said that the orders of the Supreme Court have been obeyed is actually indicative of the fact that the Supreme Court is an extremely respected institution. I'm not saying sometimes it doesn't cross the boundaries and transgress into the domain of the legislature or the government. But by and large, it's always well-meaning, And because people know it's well-meaning and well-intentioned, there is always compliance with its orders.
Okay, Vivek ji, there is a lot of heated conversation going on. And I know the systems of government have been designed by our constitution to be a check and balance, that there is, we want Team India to be working, but also Team India to be keeping check on its teammates. But having said that, a lot of things have gone said and unsaid. You know what's going on regarding NJAC and a lot of other issues being raised in Parliament by the Law Minister. Sonia Gandhi ji yesterday was addressing Congress MPs, and she was, accusing the Law Minister of delegitimizing the judiciary. Is it not okay for him to be critical on certain things?
Mrs. Gandhi did speak about what you said, but it was also the context that the whole country is worried that not only judiciary, but all other institutions are impacted today. When we see income tax, we see ED, we see CBI, we see other intelligence agencies acting in a very partisan manner, always after their political opponents or some business houses. It becomes startling that all is not well. You can't have a civil society or an orderly society if you have all these guys chasing you all the time when you are in the opposition. I think the agencies should be accountable to the country and to the Constitution of India, not to a political party or to an individual.
Okay, but Tankha ji, you yourself have been commenting and writing extensively on the comments regarding NJAC and others that have come our way. Are they unfair? Is it unfair for a minister to say that an act of parliament was overturned and maybe it should not have been?
Where I disagree with the minister is that if you have an opinion that the judgment of the Supreme Court does not reflect the correct legal position, the government, I tweeted that also. I said the government should show courage and file a review petition. And if the review petition is dismissed, file a curative petition. Take that judgment to a larger bench. You can't have a judgment looking at you and keep saying as a responsible constitutional functionary, no, it's a bad judgment, it's a bad judgment. No, if a vice president or the law minister make a statement like this, it's looked at with a lot of seriousness. It's not any ordinary man saying that. So they expect that if you feel that there's a wrong, you should be also trying to correct that wrong. You can't just leave it at that and leave it unaddressed.
Okay.
Because it's worse than not speaking about it.
Okay, Mahesh ji, just a couple of years ago, you were hosting a lecture in the memory of your late great father, and the issue was media trials. And it's often the media, people like us, who come under, I would say, reasonable criticism of not really understanding what's going on and being quick to judge ourselves and then going off. Thereby, I won't say staining the process, but certainly affecting the process. So we have some introspection to do. What then is the introspection for the judges of the land, both serving and past, who have opinions on these matters? What is the introspection still pending there?
Well, I mean, I don't know what you mean really by judges introspecting, but by and large, there are bound to be friction points, right? And there are bound to be disagreements between different wings of government and the judiciary. Intra-judiciary, there are bound to be disputes. There are always friction points. But I don't think there's any need to, if you're talking about the NJAC, for instance, right, the subject which has now become a hot topic and which you also naturally raised, right? This has been first decided by a 5-judge bench, then a 7-judge bench, and now by a 11-judge bench by a majority of 10-1. Obviously, with the executive, it rankles, right? The decision that the appointment of judges should be in the hands of an unelected body like the judiciary. It rankles with them, and they haven't quite got used to the idea that while it doesn't happen in any other country, that judges appoint future Supreme Court judges and future High Court judges, right? It still happens in India. So that probably is something they haven't really got used to, the government.
So how do we
But
have a conversation?
having said that, you know, the entire movement for an independent judiciary and giving that space to the judiciary to appoint judges really came because of the trauma of the emergency. When at that time you declared a fraudulent emergency, and not only did you declare a fraudulent emergency, you superseded judges, right, who you thought were independent and wouldn't toe your line, and then got a judgment from subservient judges to declare the emergency to be a legitimate one. So I suppose a lot of space was conceded. You know, the pendulum keeps swinging. So my generation, for instance, right, we had that trauma of the emergency, and I still believe in the independence of the judiciary, and I think it's a good thing that judges are the appointing agents are the appointing authority for all members of the Supreme Court and the High Court. Now, the point is,
Okay, basically, so
the bill was passed. Just let me just finish.
Yes, please.
A bill was passed unanimously by both houses of parliament. And let me just tell you this. And that is why I find any friction points now totally useless. And I'll tell you, first of all, it was passed unanimously. The only member who dissented from the only member of both houses who dissented from the NJSC was my father. He said it should be with the judiciary. But again, he was talking about his experience. He was, again, you know, that we've had 3 years when the country was traumatized by suppression of civil liberties and subservient judges. So I think now the subject should be allowed to rest, right? Because there's no other mechanism. If you, Vivek ji was now just talking about, you know, that the law minister should not be doing what he's doing. Implicitly, that's what he said, right? But the fact is, he shouldn't be doing this, even though it rankles with him, for the simple reason that there is nothing he can do about it. A review is not going to help because the same judges are going to decide in the same way. You can't bring a new legislation because even if you have all members of parliament now, right, still supporting a bill which gives the executive the power to appoint judges, right, it'll go back by way of a constitutional challenge to the Supreme Court, who is not going to easily let go their power. That's the fact of the matter.
Okay. So this
the
is
issue is over now.
So Vivek ji, this is a specific issue regarding an act passed by both houses of parliament going towards constitutional review, which affects the body which was impacted by it. But in general terms, when laws pass parliament, they go to a president who can also ask for a review and send them back, but eventually they come back, he's got to sign. In general terms, not specifically NJAC terms, should the act, the writ of parliament, be taken with the gravitas that this is the will of the people?
Parliament is the will of the people. It represents the will of the people. It's a sovereign, undoubtedly, and it has its own role. We have a constitution where Parliament has a role, where judiciary has a role, where executive has a role. Now, so to say that Parliament doesn't represent the will of the people would be negating the very provisions of our constitution. I'm very sure on that. Judiciary also has a right to interpret what is legislated by the Parliament. Some people feel in India that a constitutional amendment, which is actually the complete will of the Parliament, should never be amenable to a challenge before a court of law. But there is a contrary view, and which has been the reigning law, that if you are going to tinker with the basic structure of the Constitution, obviously it will not be allowed. So, as I said, these are vexed questions. You'll never have a direct answer. There are always for and against opinions. But let me share with you one thing. Justice J.S. Verma used to be was one of the authors of this changing pattern of judicial appointments. That is, judges appointing judges through the collegium system, which, according to me also, is very incestuous. As a member of the bar, responsible member of the bar, if you go across bar councils and bar associations, everybody has the same view what I am saying, that the collegium system has not served the purpose for which it was formed. And this used to be shared by no one less than J.S. Verma himself with me. Justice Verma, much later in life, And other judges also who were part of the bench would say that we regret why were we party to a decision which today we feel is not working well. But the question, as my friend Mahesh said, what is the answer? The answer cannot be leaving it to the executive, because we don't trust the executive. You are the biggest litigant before the court. Answer cannot be leaving it to judges, because that is where the dissatisfaction arises. So the answer is an independent judicial commission where apart from judges, apart from government, even the bar is a party to the decision-making process, so that you make the process more transparent.
Okay, we have not had the last word on this matter because it's going to be long. We have limited time, but I have to ask you on other very interesting issues which perhaps have been raised, perhaps are not understood well. Mahesh ji, vacations in judiciary. Now, I know for a fact that when judges are on leave is because they have to write 1,000-page judgments, and it's not actually that they're on leave, that they work in writing on using that time to draft judgments. But in terms of the functioning of the court for weeks and months, they do cease to a large measure. Is there a reasonable review required of that?
Of the vacations for judges?
Yeah, vacation times.
Look, I mean, that period, first of all, nobody understands the workload on judges on a continuing daily basis. They have to read about 100 cases a day on miscellaneous days, right? Then they have to deliver both speedy and qualitative judgments. Now, when do they do that? They're spending Monday to Fridays, right? And sometimes the weekend, reading the briefs for the next day. They've got to get a hang of what are being said in 100 cases per bench, right? When do they write, especially in-depth constitutional judgments which have tremendous impact on this country? They do it, they've got to research. They have research teams, of course, but they've got to research, they've got to write erudite judgments, it's got to be meaningful, and sometimes there are dissenting judgments, they discuss amongst themselves, they try and get unanimity. I think people are being very, very unfair to the judiciary, and I'm not an apologist for the judiciary, there's much to criticize them, but people are being very unfair to the judiciary when they say that the vacation period, and I'm not saying this because as a lawyer also I enjoy the vacation, and I don't work during the vacations, but honestly speaking, from the point of view of the judiciary, this is a much needed break for the purpose not only of relieving some stress, but for writing good erudite judgments.
Okay, but it's an open question. I mean, we in the media also feel that media accountability should be left to the media itself, so I understand the premise. But then judicial accountability is left then to whom? To the judges themselves? It's an open question, and I don't think it's settled here because interesting points have been raised across the board, but it is also an open question that can we have this conversation in the larger domain, and is it the prerogative to Parliament to freely have this conversation without thinking that they are then therefore interfering in somebody else's turf? That's a very interesting argument. It's definitely for another day, perhaps on the floor of Parliament as well. Mahesh Jethmalani Vivek Tankha, thank you very much for joining us and coming down for the India News Manch. Appreciate your time.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.